Today, we're diving into some really thought-provoking source material. It's the 2010 French television show, The Game of Death. Essentially, it was a modern take, a large-scale replication, really, of Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments. They had 80 guests, ordinary people, who were led to believe they were administering increasingly powerful electric shocks, fake ones, thankfully, to another contestant who was actually an actor.
And the results were, well, staggering, even compared to Milgram's original findings, which were already controversial enough. You had 80% of these guests, that's 64 people, continuing all the way to the highest shock level, a supposed 460 volts. This was despite hearing the actor scream, plead, starting from quite a low voltage, around 180 V.
Exactly. And that 80% figure, it forces us to ask a really fundamental question about what we're seeing. Is this extreme level of obedience, this willingness to go to 460 volts, primarily reflecting something, well, deeply ingrained and problematic about human nature itself? A kind of inherent moral weakness when faced with authority?
Or, and this is the other side of the coin, is this result almost entirely down to the very specific, let's say, manipulative, psychological design of the experiment? The factors deliberately put in place by the show's creators and the television environment.
And that's where we diverge slightly. My perspective is that the obedience we see here, shocking 80%, is fundamentally a product of those specific situational design choices. They were deliberately engineered, I'd argue, to minimize the individual participant's sense of personal responsibility for their actions.
While I absolutely acknowledge the power of that situation, I land differently. For me, these results point toward something more fundamental, a pervasive human tendency toward, well, moral fragility, a really concerning failure to resist authority when it commands something unjust. That 80% isn't just a number. It feels like a manifestation of what some might call collective sin, revealing a deep lack of personal conscience in that moment.
Okay, let's unpack that. From my side, looking at that extreme 80% figure, the first thing we have to examine closely are the design elements that produced it. I think we need to interpret this less as a final judgment on the inherent cruelty of those 64 individuals who are described as ordinary people, Ping Fan de Ren, and more as a failure, frankly, of social and experimental ethics. The compliance seems almost manufactured by, well, at least 4 key factors that the consultants brought in.
Okay.
First, and maybe the most significant, was the intentional displacement of responsibility. The participants were consistently told, assured even, that they were just following the protocol of the national television station. So the consequences, perceived or real, weren't their fault. They belonged to the host, the institution. Second, the setup itself was designed to reduce what you might call execution pressure. The guest could only hear the victim. They couldn't see them. And we know from psychological studies that making the victim invisible or isolating them is a really powerful way to kind of disconnect the action from empathy. It creates a sort of behavioral shield when you don't see the suffering directly. Third, you had intense, immediate pressure from the authority figure, the host. They were relentless, making it incredibly difficult, maybe even socially painful within that studio setting, to refuse.
Right.
And finally, don't forget the audience. They were there, they were encouraged to applaud when people continued. This creates a really strong conformity effect. So you take these factors together, and you see how ordinary people, likely operating under the assumption that a national TV show couldn't have a real problem, were in essence manipulated. It softens the interpretation, moving it away from inherent evil towards situational coercion.
See, I'm sorry, but I just can't fully accept that the design, however complex or high pressure, completely absolves these individuals of their moral agency. I think the result does show a failure of personal conscience, a failure of moral resistance. It echoes, quite disturbingly, Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil. You know, the concept that terrible things aren't always done by monsters, but sometimes by ordinary people just following procedures without thinking. And look at the numbers again. Milgram, back in 1963, got 65% compliance to the maximum shock. fast forward almost 50 years, and this French show gets 80%. Now, if human nature was inherently resistant, or if we learned anything collectively from Milgram, you'd hope, maybe expect, that number to decrease, right? Not jump up. The fact that the baseline, let's call it, of subservience was already high and then could be so easily pushed up another 15%, that suggests to me the fundamental weakness is indeed within the individual's capacity to choose what's right over simply obeying.
That's an interesting point about the increase.
And furthermore, we can't just assume they were completely ignorant of the danger. The source material points out that standard French household voltage is 220 volts. Okay? So going up to 460 volts, especially when you're hearing someone screaming, reportedly near collapse around 320V, 380V, they can't just be brushed aside as naive trust in the institution. Their defense, essentially, I was just following orders, is precisely the argument that history and courts have repeatedly rejected, from Nuremberg onwards. The core issue, I believe, is a widespread societal lack of training, perhaps, in how to distinguish just authority from unjust authority. And that leads to these kinds of collective moral failures.
Okay, let's zero in on that specific increase then. The jump from Milgram's 65% to this 80%. You're arguing the 65% itself shows the inherent weakness, and the extra 15% is just proof of how easily it's exploited.
Well, yes. If the experimenters themselves said their goal, their design, was to let most guests succeed in implementing the electric shock, doesn't the fact that they did succeed so effectively demonstrate that the raw material they were working with, that tendency towards submission, the 65%, is the real problem? They just found a better way to leverage a pre-existing human flaw.
That's one way to look at it, certainly a powerful framing. But I think it might misplace the causal emphasis. Let's accept, for argument's sake, Milgram's 65% as a kind of baseline obedience under strong authority. That additional 15% isn't necessarily proof that humanity got worse over 50 years. Instead, couldn't it be the direct, measurable impact of those extra psychological controls the French team added? Think about the specific mechanisms we talked about. That 15% difference could very well be the yield you get from maximizing the displacement of responsibility, from adding that crucial victim invisibility factor, and from throwing in the conformity pressure of a live cheering audience. These are structured external forces. They aren't necessarily indicators of growing internal malice or worsening human nature. You don't need to posit some kind of decay in human morality to explain the 80%. You just need to acknowledge that the situation was expertly optimized to produce moral failure. The science here seems to point more towards the power of the situation rather than innate cruelty.
But you're separating the psychological mechanics from the moral reality on the ground, aren't you? Regardless of the design, the person is still there. They're controlling a switch, clearly marked with escalating numbers, escalating danger, and they are viscerally hearing human suffering. We have to talk about what they knew or should have known, and the undeniable signal of pain involved in pushing that voltage up to 460V.
Okay.
I just find it hard to believe that participants completely switched off their own knowledge base. The host can reassure them all day long, but surely at some level the human mind registers the difference between a game and genuine acute distress, especially when you're talking about high levels of electricity.
I absolutely understand the weight of that point, especially when we talk about such high voltages. But I still come back to the power of that institutional context, the diffusion of responsibility, as the key mitigating factor for understanding their actions, if not excusing them. The source material explicitly mentions participants saying they believed the show because it was from the national TV station should not have a problem. They framed it mentally as only a television program. And that framing, that assumption of institutional legitimacy is so critical. It effectively allowed them to sort of outsource their ethical reasoning. The thought process becomes, okay, this might seem bad, it sounds bad, but the institution guarantees it's fundamentally safe, or at least not lethally dangerous. That belief, however misguided it seems in hindsight, acts as a powerful psychological shield. It reframes the situation in their minds from a test of personal cruelty to a test of obedience within a sanctioned environment.
But surely that assumption has its limits. I mean, doesn't it just collapse when you hit 460 volts? Especially knowing that 220V, your everyday household current, is already dangerous. And beyond the numbers, the sound of the suffering. The source says the actor was screaming, begging, near collapse at 320V, 380V. To me, that signals a clear failure to maintain even a basic moral bottom line. At the point where the suffering becomes so undeniable, so extreme, the choice seems stark: disobey the authority or knowingly inflict potential cruelty. And 64 people chose obedience over what seems like basic human compassion. This isn't just some abstract debate about an old TV show experiment, right? It really gets to the heart of what makes us willing or unwilling to harm others.
Precisely.
And that pulls us right back to Arendt's concept. I really think banal evil applies here, not because it was mass murder, but because the phenomenon it describes, this widespread, almost mundane adherence to authority, even when it leads to harm, is so universal.
Okay.
You see echoes of it everywhere, don't you? Safety departments relaxing standards for a bridge because of bureaucratic pressure, finance people cooking the books to meet targets, food companies cutting corners on safety. In this case, the guests, I argue, committed a collective moral failing by prioritizing the rules of the game show, the commands of the host, over the evident suffering of another person. The fact that it was a TV show doesn't change the internal moral compromise that those 64 individuals made. These larger atrocities we see, whether corporate fraud or institutional abuse, they aren't usually the work of one evil mastermind, but the result of many ordinary people down the line failing to resist, failing to say no.
That's a very powerful connection to make. And the point about institutional corruption and the banality of evil in bureaucratic settings is absolutely valid. But I'd frame the comparison to the game of death slightly differently. While the concept fits well with, say, corporate fraud or negligence, equating the compliance we saw in this specific, highly staged psychological experiment where, remember, the designers explicitly worked to maximize consequence displacement, equating that directly with the kind of deliberate, systemic evil required for, say, the Holocaust or major financial fraud or selling tainted food, I worry that risks minimizing the unique gravity, the calculated intentionality of those real-world crimes.
I see the distinction you're making.
The crucial difference, for me, is the intensity of the immediate social pressure, combined with those explicit institutional assurances of safety. The design was meticulously crafted to make them feel like pawns, like functionaries, carrying out a predetermined script within a controlled environment. It wasn't necessarily about them actively choosing malice. It was about the situation stripping away their sense of agency. So the results are definitely a devastating critique of how authority can be misused, but maybe not a direct measure of innate human cruelty in the same way those other examples are.
But the end result is the same, isn't it? A deeply disturbing willingness to inflict pain on someone who was clearly suffering simply because an authority figure, in this case just a game show host, told them to keep going. The psychological design might have amplified the outcome, pushed the number higher, but it could only amplify what was already present, that individual failure in that moment to hold on to and act upon a moral bottom line.
So it seems the material really leaves us grappling with a fundamental choice in interpretation. We can look at that horrifying 80% compliance rate and see it primarily as a dark reflection on human nature itself, a sign of our inherent moral fragility, maybe, and the pervasive influence of, as you put it, collective sin when faced with authority. And that view certainly challenges each of us to think hard about our own responsibilities, where our personal moral line is drawn, and when we must resist authority, especially in the face of injustice. Or conversely, we can interpret that 80% primarily as a stark testament to the overwhelming power of situational factors, of cleverly designed psychological pressure. From this perspective, it's a story about how easily institutions, be they TV shows, corporations, or governments, can exploit human deference to authority, sometimes leading to truly disastrous actions. The primary cautionary tale, then, is perhaps aimed more at the ethics of leadership, experimental design, and institutional power, rather than solely being an indictment of the average person's character.
And perhaps the most unsettling thought is that both interpretations might hold some truth. The situation was undeniably powerful, but it acted upon individuals who in that moment made a choice. It certainly forces us to look deeper than just simple obedience, into that complex dance between who we are and the circumstances we find ourselves in. There's clearly much more to unpack in this material and its implications for how we structure our societies and institutions today.